Hey guys, welcome to my legal classes. This is Ganesh Pujari, and in the series of Interpretation of Statutes, in my last class we have understood what is interpretation, what are statutes, and what is the definitions for interpretation of statutes. Now comes the question, why interpretation of statutes? What are the objectives of interpretation of statutes? That is what exactly we are going to understand from this session. We will have few definitions which are telling the objects of interpretation of statutes. I also have a beautiful chart for you guys, and then we will try understand the objects of interpretation of statutes with few very interesting case laws. Not taking much of your time, let's get into the first slide. To understand why interpretation of statutes, we need to go through few important definitions. Like for example, Solomon says, the essence of law lies in the spirit, not its letter. For the letter is significant only as being the external manifestation of the intention that underlies it. Here he says, letters are not important. It is the intention of the lawmaker which is very important. And to bring the intention in a right way, interpretation of statutes is very much required. That is the first or foremost requirement of interpretation of statutes. The next definition I am taking from Cooley. Now he is not too different with Solomon, but he structures it very beautifully. He says interpretation is the art of finding out the true sense of any form of words, that is, the sense which their author intended to convey, and of enabling others to derive from them the same idea which the author intended to convey. Here he brings three important parties. One, the author, that is the legislature, is the one who makes the law. Then there are receiver, that is the parties in any suit or proceeding. Now they are the receiver or the people or the citizen of a particular nation. In between them there is an interpreter, that is the court. Now the court should have the art of finding the true sense of the law that is being made by legislation, and it should ensure that whatever the author intended to convey to the receiver, the same has been conveyed. That is what Cooley says. Maxwell keeps it very simple. He says the object of all interpretation is to determine what is conveyed either expressly or impliedly by the language used in the statute. Now every statute will have language, and there will be some meaning which may be expressly or impliedly available, and the interpretation is required, or the objective of the interpretation is to determine what is conveyed. That is why interpretation of statutes is required as per Maxwell. The last definition that I am taking from Halsbury's Law of England, where it said the object of all interpretation of a written document is to discover the intention of the author. The written declaration of whose mind the document is always considered to be. Consequently, the construction must be as near to the minds and apparent intention of the parties as possible and as the law will permit. Here he is discussing about the object as well as he continues with the word construction. Now this construction is not mostly separated from interpretation. So we need to understand what is construction also. That will be one of my independent class where I will explain what is construction and how construction is different from interpretation. That is another part we need to keep in our mind. But for now, all that we need to understand from here, that is in the Halsbury's Law of England, is the objective of interpretation of statutes is to discover the intention of the author. That is very important aspect we need to remember. In my next slide, I have very important contents along with chart. Let's get into that slide. Here comes the chart that I was referring, and this chart is the heart of my entire discussion. When we are discussing about any statutes, there are two important parts for every single statutes. That is the legislative language and the legislative intention. Now, you cannot write anything without using a language. But if you are thinking by using a particular language, you can bring 100% of your intention in black and white. That may not be possible, because we are not God. We don't have that divine power to give 100% accuracy to a language and express our intention, because law is not maths. In maths, it's very easy. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. But in law, it cannot be so easy. Law is so complicated, where in times it becomes very difficult to express every intention in the form of language. Now, to interpret the statutes, we need to interpret in two different ways. One on the language, the other on the intention. Now, that becomes the major objective of interpretation of statutes. Now, why do we interpret the statutes language? Because to discover the meaning of that particular statute, we need to interpret the statutes. And why are we interpreting the intention? Now, the moment I say the intention, there are again two different intentions. One, the intention of the author or the legislator. The second one, the intention of the law as whole. Yes, it is very important to understand the intention of author as well as the law. Like for example, for the intention of author, you might have heard about Trump wall or Mexico wall. If there are any law or statutes related to that particular wall, to understand the intention of such statutes, we need to go back to the intention of the author of that particular time. We need to understand what Trump intended to do by doing such statutes. That is very important aspect. That is what precisely we are going to discuss when we are discussing the mischief rule. We are going to discuss that in detail. Now I am giving pause there. Coming to the intention of law. Now we need to understand why such laws came to existence. What are the intention? Like for example, if you see in Indian scenario, the 2013 and 2018 Criminal Amendment Acts gave a lot of importance related to the increasing punishment for the rapist. Why such kind of law came into existence at that particular time? Because there were a lot of rape cases reported. They gave a lot of importance and people gave a lot of importance. There were a lot of fight and law wanted to be very stringent towards the accused and give justice to the victim. That is how the intention of law became very strict at that particular time. Here, the person who is interpreting the law or the statute need to understand what is the intention. So he need to know all of this. So basically, when we are discussing about interpretation of statutes, there are two major objects. One, to understand the legislative language. The other one, to understand the legislative intention. And finally, convey the meaning of the maker to the receiver. Here we have three parties. One which makes the law, that is the legislature. One which receives the law, that is the parties in suits and proceedings. And finally, who is interpreting? It is the court which has to convey the meaning of the maker to the receiver. That is the objects of the interpretation of statutes. To understand the objects of interpretation of statutes, the beautiful case law that you need to refer is Seaford Court Estates Limited versus Asher. I suggest you guys to log in and search for this case law and read the wordings from Lord Dennings in full details. However, I have brought the heart of whatever he wanted to convey us. Now he says English language is not an instrument of mathematical precision. I have already told. In maths, it's very easy. 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. You ask this question in India, Cambodia, Pakistan, USA, China, Europe, Japan, wherever you go and ask this question, what is 1 plus 1? It is 2. Mathematics is so precise, but English language is not so precise. We can interpret a word in many different ways. So, That being the challenge, if there are some precision missing in the statutes, court cannot say or fold its hands and say that the mistake is done by the draftsman or the legislature. I cannot do anything. That's not what court has to do. Court has to give force and life to the intention of such statutes or law. That is the job of the court, and that is where the interpretation of statutes plays a very important role. Here it becomes very significant that how exactly court is giving force and life to the intention of legislature. Now court has to understand the language used, court has to understand the intention of the lawmaker or the author, and then the court has to give force and life to the intention of the legislature and give a right message to the receiver. That is what interpretation of statute all about, and I repeat, please read the judgment or Lord Denning's comment on Seaford Court Estates Limited versus Asher case. Now, looking at this presentation, you might be feeling that for everything interpretation of statute it's required. No, there are certain amount of limitations which I am going to discuss with three important case laws in my next slide. While interpretation and constructions are very important, it is not necessary that every single time court has to do that. Rather, there are limitations on court to not to do any kind of interpretation or construction in certain scenarios. Now, I slowly started using a new term, construction, which I am going to explain in my next class in detail, but try to understand this concept with these three case laws. Now here, in the first case law, that is R.S. Nayak versus A.R. Antule, the Supreme Court said, if the words of the statutes are clear and unambiguous, it is the plainest duty of the court to give effect to the natural meaning of the words used in the provision. The question of construction arises only in the event of an ambiguity or the plain meaning of the words used in the statute would be self-defeating. Now, just because you know interpretation of statutes, you cannot start doing interpretation and construction for everything. You need to do interpretation or construction when there are ambiguity available or when the wordings in the statute is not clear. When the meaning is very clear, the language is very clear, the court should not try to do any kind of interpretation or construction. That is what held here. The second and third case law are in quite similar line, and I will quickly read through them. And remember, you need to remember the case law names of R.S. Nayak versus A.R. Antule and M.S. Grasim Industries Limited versus Collector of Customs Bombay. You can use them anywhere, at least in the conclusions of a particular question. You can use them and say that interpretation of statute is not required unless and until it is really required to express the intention of the author. Now, you can refer these case laws, and these are landmark judgments. And here in this case law, that is M.S. Grasim Industries Limited versus Collector of Customs, it was held that where the words are clear and there is no ambiguity and the intention of the legislature is clearly conveyed, there is no scope for the court to take upon itself the task of amending or altering the statutory provisions. Wherever the language is clear, the intention of the legislature is to be gathered from the language used. Why do we elect legislators? To make the laws, to amend the laws, to alter the laws. Now, if the courts start to take over it, like amending or altering any of the statute, it is like overriding the legislature. That is not allowed. That is what held in this particular case law. See the beauty of the case laws. The court itself is saying that our responsibility is not to amend or altering any of the statute, or we don't have right to amend or alter the statutes. That is the responsibility of the legislature, and that is how it need to be and it should be. That is the beauty of these case laws. Now, coming to the last case law, that is Crawford versus Spooner. It was held that we cannot aid the legislature's defective phrasing of an act, we cannot add or mend, and by construction make up deficiencies which are left there. Now, if there are deficiencies available or defects available, code cannot mend. Code cannot do too much of construction. It is not with the hands of code. If there are some minute requirement to give the right intention of the statute or to achieve the right intention of the statute, of course code can do some amount of construction. But if the intention itself is not clear, if there are defective phrasing or deficiencies available, in that case code should not take too much of liberty to amend those acts. That is what held here.
We have two options in our life: to be a scissor or to be a needle. Scissor can cut relationships while needle can stitch relationships. So we should always try to be a needle.
Nishan, as this is the series of interpretation, I would like to see the other side. Yes, it is not good to cut relationship, but if we are stitching relationship with bad people, that is not good. In such cases, it is better not to stitch, rather go for a cut.
With that, I'm concluding this session.